The survival regime. The survival regime is an exploration of survival as the dominant form of politics in globalization. So what is that, and where does it come from? This started maybe 9 or 10 years ago, when I began to see how some of the political movements and phenomena that were happening could no longer be understood according to the main political categories that were available. And I'm thinking here of Black Lives Matter, of the Syrian war and the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean, of the immigrant situation and all the undocumented workers, or of the Catalan movement for independence, in which I'm personally involved. But I began to see how these phenomena could not be understood according to the main concepts of the political that we had inherited from the 20th century, and especially the last part of the century. And here I'm thinking of, for instance, Carl Schmitt, of course, friend and enemy distinction, the Syrian war. You can talk about friends and enemies, but it's not clear who the enemy is, and who is what, where is where, and so on. The template of closer struggle, of course, could illuminate certain aspects of each of these movements, and yet it couldn't really capture the singularity of each of them. The last instance, maybe, of closer struggle, the Multitude versus Empire by Hart and Negri, is an attempt to do that, and yet it didn't feel. It feels somehow reductive or not that useful. Hegemony and the recognition of demands, as Laclau and Mouffe developed, was also something that could be detected in some of the movements, and yet it didn't really explain the political core of them in many ways. Another very prevalent theorization of the political by Jacques Rancière, the part of the no part against the police order. Again, the question of exclusion obviously plays a role in all these movements, and yet it's not that we just want to be included, we just want to be recognized. There's something else going on here. And finally, the event, as Alain Badiou's theorization of the event is a very powerful thing, of course, and yet it wasn't clear where an event would be taking place here, and how to distinguish an event from a pseudo event or a non-event at all. So that was one of the first problems that I encountered. The other thing that led me to all this theorization was the concept of global war that the Italian theorist Carlo Galli developed after 9/11, after the terrorist attacks. And in his theorization, he claims that in globalization we have a new typology of violence that is different from what we had before in modernity. He says that in the first part of modernity, up to the 19th century, we had the real absolute war, which is termed by Clausewitz, and yet what this means is that war was regulated by the states, and it served to negotiate a state power and so on. In the 20th century, total war, a concept by Raymond Aron, explained a shift in the dominant form of violence, and there the dominant element is no longer the negotiation of a state power, but rather the extermination of sometimes internal, sometimes external populations for what Foucault would call the purification of the social body, or the biopolitical reasoning. Obviously the Holocaust or nuclear bombing were paradigmatic cases of total war. Now, in global war, violence is no longer necessarily tied to state power or to biopolitics, And it's rather a permanent state of boundless conflict that in which you never know when a war begins, when a war ends, what are the main agents. So war, or war violence, adopts almost a productive role in its own destructiveness. So Galli concluded by saying that in global war, what we have is the collapse of the political architecture of modernity, namely the modern state, but also citizenship and all the subject, all the political categories that structure modernity. Now, my intervention came because I thought that, well, there is the collapse, certainly, but maybe we should start also thinking about what's after this collapse. And that's where survival comes in as perhaps a useful notion. Now, the question of survival is that survival has been theorized previously, of course, and there's mainly three issues that survival encapsulates. So one is precisely survival is not doesn't define a political form. Survival is the pre-political condition of politics, and that's famously the war of all against all in Hobbes, or the state of nature in Locke. So survival is precisely what is left behind, what is overcome once you institute a political space, and specifically the modern state. Now, a second theorization of survival is the biopolitical one. Biopolitics says by protecting the life of its subjects, the modern state is reducing this life to bare life, what Agamben famously says, bare life, for the purification or the immunization of the social body. So in this sense, it's a reduction of life, of political life, to survival. Now, the main theorization has to do with neoliberalism. Survival is the reason, the rationale of neoliberal, the neoliberal ideology, whether in the form of celebration, we know about the survival of the fittest or the law of the strongest that we hear all the time, or in a critical fashion, like Wendy Brown says that neoliberalism is the reduction of political life to economic survival. So my concept of survival or exploration draws from these previous concepts, of course, and yet also tries to move away from them. I think that survival in this global war of globalization allows us to explore and theorize the zone of the distinction between war, permanent war, between politics, what we could call some politics that are always already being formed and always already being destroyed, and also finally capital, which is obviously the third essential element here in global capitalism and globalization. So survival could allow us to shed light on this. Perhaps I call it a degree zero of governmentality, in which life itself constitutes the central form of political specialization. Now, this specialization comes from these singular struggles of survival that result from the need and also the desire to live in the midst of global war and permanent conflict. So another way of putting this is that the being here, just the fact of being alive, is already a constituent and productive politicization that does not result in stable or juridically formalized spaces. So one of the things that the notion of survival allows us to do too is to periodize this moment of global war vis-a-vis the previous moments of modernity. And here I draw from the famous stages of capitalism that Ernest Mandel drew already in the 1970s, when he defined a first stage of capitalism as market capitalism, then imperialism, and then the second half of the 20th century, multinational finance. And then Fredric Jameson famously transposed these categories onto the cultural field and talked about the main aesthetics of each stage: realism, modernism, and postmodernism. So I propose that if we add the typologies of war of Carlo Galli, then to this series of correspondences, then this allows us to shed light on the political form of each period. And that's where I deduce from this that perhaps we can say that the first period takes the political form of sovereignty. Again, the interstate conflict and the negotiation of state, or the very building of state power, in fact, makes sovereignty the dominant form of politics. In the 20th century, biopolitics again is the logic that takes a dominant role, as we were saying, the total war of total destruction engages in this extermination and genocidal politics. And then survival can be a name for the political form, dominant political form in our current stage. I also, in my project, I also developed what we could call the ontological forms of these politics, and then dialectics between particular universal would correspond to sovereignty. Otherness, as Levinas theorizes it between totality and infinity, would correspond to a moment of biopolitics. And then I developed this as immanence between local and global, and as again maybe the ontological version of this. This is more complicated, but I could develop it further some other time. But let's see, what is it to survive? Survival is not simply the content of politics in globalization, and survival is not the vanishing of politics or the appearance of a post-political moment. I claim that survival is rather the explosion of politics because of this constant intervention that results from the situation of permanent conflict. So we have a moment of hyper-politicization rather than the vanishing of politics. Life itself has immediate political meaning, so that's where it comes from. Now, the specific, more collective form of politics emerges from what I call the collective assemblages that react to a common catastrophe or a common crisis or a common threat. So in a way, politics becomes a reactive enterprise that is always responding to what's happening, what's being in a way what is being destroyed. Another or a specific feature of this is that the temporality of politics changes because of this reactive condition. So we don't have the futural or programmatic projection of politics that we had in modernity. Instead, the affirmation of politics takes place in the present, and therefore produces open to a certain future, and yet when it's taking place, in a way it has already taken place because the catastrophe in a way has already happened. So we have a modeling of the three moments, the past, present, and future, and that's what I call the temporality of the always already, as if politics are not a project, not a program, but they are always already there, always already happening, and once they are there, they have already taken place somehow. But I developed that, further in many ways. Another consequence of this temporality is precisely the difficulty to distinguish between good progressive events and bad reactionary events. I claim that since we no longer have the temporality of the new, of modernity, the purity of what we could call the left and the right has become untenable, and now each act of survival, so to speak, constitutes a mixture of progressive and regressive events, and that's how we need to approach them and theorize them. I talk about the three F's of survival. Fighting, it will be one, as I said, it's the engagement in war. In fact, we could say like four F's, and it will be fighting, and it's like a fuck you, it's an act of opposition, a frontal opposition that becomes direct and central. Freedom is perhaps another. Unlike in previous constitutions of the political, in which maybe equality or even fraternity would play a more visible role in organizing, inclusion or recognition, I think that freedom in a situation of war becomes more incisive, because the act of politics emerges as an act of liberating yourself or escaping even from a certain situation of catastrophe. So the act of liberation or freeing yourself becomes more central. Finally, friendship perhaps is the main affect that is being produced in these collective assemblages. Friendship is, again, a sinuous notion. It takes place and yet it doesn't last beyond the moment of realization, beyond the moment of assembling, of reacting to the threat. And yet there's something about friendship that I take back to the polis, the Greek polis. Plato already talks about the friendship of the polis, and obviously in a way sometimes it all goes back to the Greek polis as in any theorization of the political. But the last thing I wanted to say is that you may wonder about the iguana. The iguana, I claim, represents whatever it is that our conjuncture represents. But this comes from Marx and Foucault said that modernity was represented by the mole, and the tunnels of the mole represented the enclosures of modernity and the factory and the disciplinary society and many of those things. Then Deleuze said that in postmodernity it was no longer the mole, it was the snake that represented the times, because the snake would be not going underground, but would be sliding through the surfaces of the society of control and the society in the spaces of consumerism. I say that perhaps the iguana represents our time and this survival in global war, because there's two things. First, the iguana has two moves. The iguana is either completely static in order to avoid detection, or she runs. Once she has been detected, then she has to run, she has to flee. So I think that these two moves, represent, with no in between, represent perhaps the positionings of politics in global war. The iguana is also maybe representative of this temporality in which the past, the present, and the future fold up onto each other. The iguana looks like a prehistoric animal, and at the same time it seems like an animal that comes from the future, and yet it is here, right? So perhaps that aspect can also be illuminating.
Yeah, it seems like a pessimistic vision of the present, and a question for you would be, sometimes under your label of freedom, in your analysis, some groups end up more oppressed. So while looking for freedom, or what is supposed to be the vision of freedom, at the end of the day, they end up oppressed. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you. My account certainly doesn't want to be a melancholic, rendering of, well, the politics of modernity were very, emancipatory, and they protect us, all of us, and therefore we need to try to, save them or conserve them. It's not that at all. I really don't want to suggest that this is. I would even say this is not even apocalyptic. I would say this is even post-apocalyptic. My claim is to avoid both celebration and condemnation of this, and I don't think that is pessimistic, because in fact survival tries to theorize all the things that are going on constantly. That how politics is a very urgent and physical and bodily activity, and therefore this produces pain, and this produces you have to engage in conflict all the time. So there's no moment of peace or some post-bellum pacification, and yet it also energizes you. You're always you're actively you're an active political being or agent. So I don't see it as pessimistic. Again, the question about like the effectiveness of this political life, it's unclear. It's unclear. The idea is that perhaps we should start measuring the effectiveness not in terms of, well, how the conflict was resolved, or how this produced a new, stable space that somehow left behind the moment of conflict, but we need perhaps to find a new measure to evaluate the effectiveness of political acts. That would be my take.
Thank you.
Yeah. Ricardo.
Thank you very much, Professor. I would say more nihilistic than pessimistic. And when you made the analogy of the iguana, it sent me back to both Hobbes, in the sense of not the war of all against all, but the avoidance of war due to the imminent annihilation. And in the running moment, as in the survival, the Spinoza moment of survival at all costs. My question is, will the iguana strike back, or is only a moment of avoiding conflict and running away from conflict?
That's interesting. Yeah, the iguana doesn't really strike back. You're right. She doesn't fight back. So in that respect, the iguana doesn't represent the whole business of survival. You're right. We should have a third move here. It's either you're static, you run away, or you fight back. And the iguana doesn't do that. So we need to come up with another animal that the three things. But no, I think this is very well observed. Yeah, because it's true. Fighting back is essential. It's not always there. Sometimes the fighting back is the exodus, the escape. But sometimes it is there, or we could say that escaping is a way of fighting back too, right? Or escaping oppression.
Okay. So I'm really struck by the way that you talk about the temporality of politics and always, did I steal yours? I'm sorry.
I'm so glad.
But I'm really struck by the sort of move from a present from which we project both the past and the future to a future that is already acting on the present. It reminds me a lot of the way that Deleuze talks about time and difference in repetition, the logic of sense, and that kind of leads into my question, which is, how do you account for the sort of interiorization of this survival imperative? My sense is that, and you kind of mentioned the affective portion of it with friendship, my sense is that it has something to do with sort of more the affective parts of Deleuze and Guattari, maybe Spinoza as well, so I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
Yes, it's all there. That's right. The interiorization would I would definitely say that it's there. as long as we don't conceive interiorization in subjective terms, because these are these have dissolved. So so interiorization in terms of affects that coalesce, so to speak, and that creates some space, some limited space that therefore that marks, however minimally or however provisionally marked an interior that is different from an exterior. That is definitely there, and obviously I think modulation would be another term to describe this interiorization. When you have in an immanent space, then you have moments of inflection, modulation, or intensification that then create this moment of affect, or this what we could call this assemblage, or this what we could call collective assemblage. Again, it's a matter of trying to avoid the subjective terms that would take us back to the political architecture of modernity. Right?
It creates a new body in a way that's not just the body of the subject.
Exactly. Yeah, body obviously is another central notion, of course. Yeah.